at 11:47 p.m. Inside the Grand Sterling Hotel's charity gala, Harper Collins was on her knees, wine dripping from her uniform while 200 guests laughed. "Know your place," Eleanor Sterling whispered, her red lips curling into a cruel smile. Harper's face went pale. Her hands trembled against the cold marble floor. Then Julian Vance rose from the head table. The room fell silent. He placed his jacket over Harper's shaking shoulders and said, "Sit down, Eleanor." Eleanor froze. Julian leaned close to Harper's ear, his gray eyes deadly calm. "I saw what she put in my glass. Dawn to speak. Walk out now." But when Harper reached the parking garage, she found a note in his pocket. "You re not safe tonight. Neither is your sister." And that was the moment Harper realized the spilled wine was only the beginning. Stay with us, because this mafia boss romance is about to uncover a deadly secret no one was supposed to survive. The marble floor was cold enough to bite through Harper's uniform. She knelt there anyway, because the alternative was worse. Above her, the chandelier threw diamonds of light across 200 guests who had all stopped talking at once. That kind of silence had weight. It pressed down on her shoulders harder than the wine soaking through her blouse. She had seen it happen, just seconds before the glass hit the floor. She'd watched Eleanor Sterling tip a small vial into the wine, meant for the man at the head of the table. Harper had frozen, unsure what to do with what she knew. Then Eleanor's foot found the table leg, and the whole thing came crashing down on her instead. Oh my God. Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest, playing shock for the room. She practically threw herself at that glass. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Laughter rippled through the tables. Someone near the back muttered something about balance, about how a woman her size should know to watch her step. Harper kept her eyes on the floor. She thought about Chloe's inhaler, sitting empty in the bathroom cabinet at home, and about the rent due in 6 days, and she said nothing. Eleanor crouched down to her level, close enough that only Harper could hear the next part. "Know your place," she said, and smiled for the cameras that were already coming out of pockets around the room. Harper had worked in this hotel for 2 years. She had learned a long time ago that dignity was a luxury item, priced out of her budget. So she stayed on her knees, soaked and humiliated, and waited for someone to tell her she could stand. Instead, a chair scraped back. Julian Vance rose from his seat at the head table, and the room's attention swung to him like a compass needle finding north. Harper had noticed him earlier, the way everyone had. He wasn't loud about it, he didn't need to be. He was the kind of man whose stillness made other people nervous. He walked around the table without hurrying. Guests leaned back in their chairs to let him pass, the way people do around something they don't fully understand but know not to touch. He stopped in front of Harper and looked down at her for a moment, not with pity, with something closer to recognition. Then he shrugged out of his jacket. It was a small gesture, and it changed everything. Custom wool, cut to fit a man worth more than the building they were standing in, settled around Harper's shoulders. It was warm from his body. It smelled like cedar and something sharper underneath. Gunmetal, maybe. Though she wouldn't have known to call it that yet. "Mr. Vance." Eleanor started, her voice climbing an octave. "This really isn't necessary." "She's just sit down, Eleanor." 2 words. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Eleanor sat. Julian crouched beside Harper, bringing himself to her level the way Eleanor had. Except nothing about it felt the same. Eleanor had knelt to deliver an insult. Julian knelt like he was correcting one. He leaned in close. His lips barely moved against her ear. "I saw what she dropped in the glass," he said low enough that the words belonged only to her. "Don't speak. Just walk out." Harper's heart slammed against her ribs. She turned her head a fraction of an inch, enough to catch his eyes, gray and unreadable and utterly serious. He wasn't joking. He wasn't performing kindness for an audience the way Eleanor performed cruelty. He meant it. She rose on shaking legs, his jacket swallowing her frame, wine dripping from the hem of her skirt onto shoes that cost more than her monthly paycheck. The room watched her walk toward the exit. Nobody laughed this time. At the doors, she glanced back once. Eleanor's face had gone from smug to something tight and furious. watching the man she called her fiancé hand his own jacket to a maid in front of the entire city's elite. Victor Sterling, seated 2 chairs down, wasn't watching Harper at all. He was watching Julian, his expression carved from something colder than the marble floor. Harper didn't understand any of it yet. She only understood that a stranger had just done something that could cost him everything, over a spilled glass of wine and a woman he'd never spoken to before tonight. She pushed through the doors into the hallway, and behind her, the party resumed its noise like nothing had happened at all, but something had. She could feel it in the weight of the jacket on her shoulders, in the way her hands wouldn't stop shaking, in the small folded note she found in the inside pocket only after she reached the parking garage. It had one line on it, written in tight, deliberate handwriting: "You're not safe tonight. Neither is your sister." Harper stood frozen under the flickering garage light, the note trembling between her fingers, and for the first time all evening, the cold marble floor felt like the least of her problems. By the time Harper's manager found her in the parking garage, the note was already tucked deep in her bra, folded into a square smaller than a stamp. She didn't know why she hid it. Some instinct older than reason told her that whatever was happening tonight, it wasn't finished. And the fewer people who knew what she'd seen, the safer she'd be. "You're done," her manager said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his phone, at whatever was scrolling across the screen, and his face had the pale, sweaty look of a man watching his own paycheck evaporate. "Pack your locker. Now, done." "I didn't do anything." Eleanor Sterling knocked over the "I don't care what she did." He finally looked up. "Do you have any idea what's on social media right now?" He turned the phone toward her. Harper's stomach dropped. The video was already at 200,000 views. Someone had filmed the whole thing from a table near the back, close enough to catch every second of it, cropped just right to leave out the part where Eleanor's foot hit the table leg. What remained was Harper on her knees, wine dripping off her chin, and Julian Vance sliding his jacket over her shoulders like a man rescuing a stray dog. The caption read, "Mafia boss caught with his maid mistress. Fiancée humiliated at charity gala." The comments were worse. Harper scrolled through them without meaning to, the way you can't stop pressing on a bruise. People she had never met had already decided everything about her: her weight, her motives, her worth. Someone had found a photo from her old social media, blown it up, and written beneath it a single word that made her hands go cold. "Give me your badge," her manager said. "Hotel can't have this kind of attention. Corporate's already called twice." She unclipped it and set it in his palm without a word. There was nothing to argue. In this world, the maid was disposable, and the story would move on to someone else by morning. She had learned that lesson a long time ago, the hard way, the way most people like her had to learn everything. Outside, the rain had started somewhere between the gala and the walk to her car, and it hadn't let up. Harper stood under the awning at the edge of the parking structure, Julian's jacket still around her shoulders because she hadn't had the presence of mind to take it off, and she watched the water come down in sheets over the city. Her phone buzzed again and again. She finally looked at it, and her stomach turned over completely. 47 missed calls, 212 new messages. Most were strangers. A few were coworkers, already distancing themselves, already asking if she'd really done what people were saying she'd done. One was from her landlord, a text sent 20 minutes ago. "Heard about the video. We need to talk about the lease." And then there was the one that made her sit down hard on the wet concrete step, ignoring the cold soaking through her skirt. It was from Chloe's school nurse. "Chloe used her inhaler twice today. Getting low. You'll need a refill before Monday." Harper closed her eyes. She did the math she'd done 100 times before, the math that never worked out: rent, groceries, the copay on the inhaler, which had gone up again last month because insurance had reclassified something, some code she didn't understand. And now the medication that kept her sister breathing cost more than her weekly paycheck covered. She had exactly $11 in her checking account. She had just lost her job in front of the internet. And somewhere out there, a woman with more Harper would see in a lifetime had tried to poison a man and blamed her for the mess. She put her head in her hands and let herself cry for exactly 30 seconds. That was the rule she'd made for herself years ago. Back when their mother died, and everything fell on her shoulders overnight. 30 seconds to fall apart. Then you stand up. Because nobody else is going to stand up for you. She was on second 28 when headlights swept across the alley. Not one set, 4, 5. Black SUVs rolled into the narrow street behind the hotel, moving slow and deliberate. Boxing in the alley like they'd rehearsed it. Harper scrambled to her feet, her back hitting the brick wall. Her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. For one terrible second, she thought it was Eleanor's people. Come to finish whatever story they were writing about her. Then a door opened, and Julian Vance stepped out into the rain without an umbrella, without a coat, like the weather simply didn't apply to him. He crossed the alley in long strides, water darkening his shirt within seconds, and stopped a few feet from her. "You're still wearing my jacket," he said. "You told me to leave. You didn't say give it back." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Keep it. It suits you. What is this?" Harper gestured at the SUVs, at the men in dark suits standing at careful distances, watching the mouth of the alley like soldiers holding a line. "Why are you here?" Julian's expression sobered. "Because you're in more danger right now than you understand. And every minute we stand here talking is a minute I'd rather use getting you somewhere safe." "Danger from what?" "From her." Harper's voice cracked on the word. "She poured something in your glass and I'm the one who lost my job. I'm the one every stranger on the internet thinks is a homewrecker. What danger am I supposed to be worried about that's worse than that?" He studied her for a moment, rain running down his jaw, and something in his face told her he was deciding how much truth she could hold. "Eleanor didn't only try to kill me tonight," he said. "She's already building the story that you did it. There's a version of tonight circulating in certain circles where you're not a maid who got caught in the crossfire. You're a hired gun, an assassin planted by a rival family, using the hotel job as cover." Harper laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "That's insane. I've never touched a gun in my life." "Doesn't matter. The story only needs to be believable enough for the people who want it to be true." He reached into his jacket, the one he wasn't wearing, still on her shoulders, and pulled a slim folder from inside his own suit. "I need you to look at something. And I need you to understand I'm not the enemy here, even if everything about tonight makes it look that way." He held it out. Harper hesitated, rain dripping off her eyelashes, every instinct screaming at her to run in the opposite direction of a man surrounded by armed guards and blacked-out cars. But Chloe's message was still glowing on her phone screen in her other hand, and she had nowhere else to go. And something about the way he held himself, steady, patient, like he had all night to wait for her to trust him, made her reach out and take it. She opened the folder under the weak yellow light of the parking structure. There was a photograph clipped to the top page. Her mother, younger than Harper remembered her, smiling at a camera in a photo Harper had never seen before. Beneath it, a document with an official seal, the kind of paperwork you get once, on the worst day of your life, and never want to see again. Her mother's death certificate. "Why do you have this?" Harper whispered. Julian's jaw tightened. "Read the cause of death." She scanned the page, the medical language blurring under the rain and her own rising panic, until one line snagged her attention. "Cardiac arrest. Natural causes." That's what it says. "Heart attack. I know how she died. I was 14. I found her." "That's what it says," Julian agreed. "It's not what happened." Harper's hands had gone numb, and it wasn't from the cold. "What are you talking about?" "Your mother worked for a man named Victor Sterling, Eleanor's father." He watched her face as the name landed. 8 years ago, she saw something she shouldn't have. Financial records, the kind of records that don't officially exist. 2 days later, she was dead. And the death certificate was signed off by a coroner who Victor Sterling had on his payroll for 6 years before that and 3 years after. The alley seemed to tilt. Harper gripped the edge of the folder so hard the paper crumpled beneath her fingers. "You're telling me somebody murdered my mother." "I'm telling you Victor Sterling did. The same way he spent the last decade murdering anyone who got too close to what he actually is." Julian's voice dropped, quiet and controlled in a way that somehow made it more frightening than shouting would have. "Tonight wasn't an accident. Harper, Eleanor didn't spontaneously decide to poison me at a charity gala. Her father sent her to do it. Because I've spent 2 years building a case against him, and he knows I'm close. You getting caught in it was bad luck. But now that you're in it, they won't just let you walk away. Not when you're the daughter of the one witness who ever got close enough to write it all down before she died. Harper's mind raced back through every strange thing she'd shrugged off over the years. The two men who'd shown up at their apartment months after the funeral, asking vague questions about her mother's old job. The insurance payout that had come through faster and larger than it should have, like someone wanted the case closed quietly. The way certain relatives had gone quiet whenever she asked too many questions. She had been so busy surviving that she'd never let herself really look at any of it, even if all of that is true, she said, forcing her voice steady. Why do you care? You're a stranger. You gave me your jacket, and now you're telling me the mafia thinks I'm an assassin, that my mother was murdered. And you want me to just get in a car with a bunch of armed men I've never met, because in about 6 hours, once the story finishes spreading, Victor's people are going to come looking for you. And they won't be as polite as I'm being right now. He nodded toward the SUVs. You have a little sister, Chloe. 10 years old, severe asthma, 2nd grade at Lincoln Elementary. He let that sit for a second, watching the fear flash across Harper's face at how easily he'd rattled off details of her life. I'm not telling you that to scare you. I'm telling you because if I know that much about your sister in one night, so does Victor Sterling. And I'd rather you be angry at me for knowing it than find out the hard way what he plans to do with it. Harper's breath came out shaky, somewhere behind her fear. A colder, harder part of her mind was already working. The part that had kept her and Chloe alive since their mother died. The part that never let panic decide anything. If I get in that car, she said slowly, what happens to my sister? She comes with us tonight. Tonight, not tomorrow. Not after you pack a bag and think it over. Julian's gaze didn't waver. I have people at her school right now, waiting for your word. That was the moment, men, it stopped being about trust and started being about math again. The only kind of math Harper had ever been good at. A stranger with resources versus a system that had already failed her mother once. A folder full of proof versus a viral video that had already convicted her in the eyes of strangers. A little girl who needed medicine she couldn't afford versus a man who was, for reasons she didn't yet understand, offering to protect them both. Okay, she said. Okay, get my sister. Julian didn't smile, didn't perform relief the way someone else might have. He simply nodded once, turned and said something low into a small radio clipped to his collar. Within seconds, one of the SUVs peeled away from the alley, engine growling against the wet pavement. He opened the door of the car nearest to them and gestured for her to get in. Harper paused at the threshold, one hand on the cold metal frame, looking back at him one last time. You still haven't told me why you care what happens to a maid you met 2 hours ago. Something passed behind his eyes then, quick and complicated, gone before she could read it fully. Get in the car, Harper, he said instead, and reached for the gun holstered beneath his soaked shirt, checking it with the kind of casual precision that told her this wasn't the first time he'd made a promise like the one he was about to keep. I'll explain everything once your sister is safe. She climbed in. The door shut behind her with a heavy, final sound, and outside. The rain kept falling over an alley that already looked, in the wet dark, like it had never held anyone at all. Harper woke up somewhere soft. That was the first thing she noticed, before her eyes even opened. Not the thin mattress she'd slept on for 3 years. Springs pressing through fabric worn down to almost nothing. This was different, deep, even. Cool against her skin in a way that had nothing to do with cheap sheets. She sat up too fast. And the room tilted, floor to ceiling windows. A skyline she didn't recognize from this angle. High enough that the buildings below looked like something built for a model train set. A room bigger than her entire apartment, with furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine rather than a place someone actually lived. Then she remembered the gala. The video. The alley. Julian's voice telling her to get in the car, Chloe. She was out of the bed and moving before she'd finished the thought, bare feet hitting a rug so thick it swallowed the sound of her steps, yanking open a door that led into a hallway she didn't recognize. A man in a dark suit stood a few feet away, hands folded in front of him, And for one panicked second, Harper thought she'd made the worst mistake of her life. Mrs. Collins. His voice was calm, almost gentle. Your sister is just down the hall. She's fine. She's sleeping. Harper didn't trust him, didn't trust anyone in this building. But she followed him anyway, because there was nowhere else to go and because the alternative, standing frozen in a hallway waiting for someone else to decide her next move, wasn't something she knew how to do. The room he led her to had the lights dimmed low, a nightlight glowing amber in the corner. And there in a bed roughly the size of Harper's entire childhood bedroom was Chloe, fast asleep. A small clear tube ran from her nose to a humidifier machine on the nightstand. The kind of medical equipment Harper had priced out online more times than she could count, and always closed the tab before she could see the total. Her chest rose and fell, slow and steady, no wheeze catching at the edges of each breath. Harper crossed the room and sat carefully on the edge of the mattress, smoothing a strand of hair off her sister's forehead. Chloe stirred but didn't wake, mumbling something unintelligible before settling back into sleep. She was struggling to breathe when we picked her up. A voice said from the doorway, Julian out of his soaked suit now, wearing a simple gray sweater that somehow made him look less like the man from the alley and more like someone Harper might have passed on the street without a second glance. Our doctor treated her an hour ago. Nebulizer, corticosteroids. She'll sleep through the night now. You had a doctor waiting. I had a doctor waiting before I knew you'd say yes. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. I don't like leaving things to chance. Harper looked back down at her sister's face, unlined and peaceful in a way it rarely got to be, even in sleep, even before tonight. Chloe had been the one carrying the weight of worry too, in her own 10-year-old way. Always asking if they had enough for the next refill. Always trying to make her inhaler last a few extra days by using it less than she needed. Thank you, Harper said quietly. Because there was nothing else true enough to say, Julian didn't answer right away. When she finally looked over at him, his expression had shifted into something unguarded, something she hadn't seen on him yet. Come on, he said. You should eat something. It's almost 4 in the morning, but my kitchen never really closes. She followed him down a different hallway, past art that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than someone's home, into a kitchen with marble counters and appliances that gleamed like they'd never been used for anything as simple as toast. Julian moved through it with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything, pulling ingredients from a fridge the size of Harper's entire kitchen, cracking eggs into a pan without seeming to think about it. You cook, Harper said, surprised despite herself. I do a lot of things people don't expect. He glanced up, a flicker of something almost playful crossing his face. Sit down. You look like you're about to fall over. She sat at the counter, still wearing the borrowed clothes someone had left folded in the bedroom, and watched him work in silence for a while. It was strange, she thought. How a man who commanded armed guards and blacked out cars could also stand at a stove at 4 in the morning, plating scrambled eggs like it was the most natural thing in the world. I need to ask you something, she said eventually, and I need you to actually answer it this time. He set the plate in front of her and leaned against the opposite counter. Ask, why does any of this matter to you? You said Victor Sterling killed my mother because of something she saw. You said Eleanor tried to poison you tonight. That's your fight, your family's fight, whatever this is. She gestured vaguely at the penthouse around them. I'm a maid who lost her job over a viral video. I don't have money. I don't have power. I don't have anything you could possibly need. So why bring me and my sister into the middle of a war I didn't even know existed 12 hours ago? Julian was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Harper thought he might not answer at all. 8 years ago, he finally said, a man named Robert Dane was my mentor. He taught me everything I know about running an organization that doesn't just survive but actually protects the people in it. He was investigating Victor Sterling's operation from the inside, building a case that would have exposed him completely. Victor found out. Robert was killed in what the papers called a home invasion gone wrong. His jaw tightened around the memory. I was 24. I inherited his organization and his unfinished war on the same day. That still doesn't explain me. Your mother worked for Robert before she worked for Sterling's company. She was the one who first flagged the discrepancies in the books. The ones that eventually got Robert digging in the first place. Julian met her eyes. She didn't die because she saw something random. Harper. She died protecting information that Robert needed. Information she'd passed to him before Victor ever knew she existed. Harper's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. My mother worked with your mentor. She was one of the bravest people in this whole ugly story, and nobody ever gave her credit for it. I've spent 2 years trying to finish what Robert and your mother started. Tonight, when I saw Eleanor slip something into that glass, I realized Victor was done waiting. And when I saw you on your knees in that ballroom, humiliated by his daughter in front of 200 people who should have known better, something in me refused to let that be the end of your story the way it was the end of your mother's. He paused. That's not the whole truth. If I'm honest, it's most of it, but not all of it. What's the rest? He held her gaze. Steady, unflinching, and something about the directness of it made Harper's pulse skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The rest is that I watched you stay silent in that ballroom when speaking up would have cost you everything. And I watched you protect your dignity anyway, without a single person in that room deserving it from you. I don't meet a lot of people who do that. Most people, when they're pushed down, they either break or they get vicious. You did neither. He shrugged, like the admission cost him something. I found that hard to look away from. Harper didn't know what to do with that. So she looked back down at her plate and ate in silence for a while, letting the strange warmth of the kitchen and the steady sound of Chloe's breathing down the hall settle into something like calm. For the first time since she was 14 years old, since the day she'd found her mother collapse on the kitchen floor and had to become someone's parent overnight, Harper let herself believe, just for a moment, that someone else might be willing to carry some of the weight. I'm still scared, she admitted. You should be. What's coming isn't going to be easy. Julian's voice was honest in a way that somehow felt kinder than false comfort would have. But you're not carrying it alone anymore. That's the part I need you to actually hear. She nodded, not quite trusting herself to speak, and finished the last of her eggs, while the city light saints glittered beyond the windows, like nothing dangerous existed anywhere in the world. It didn't last. The television mounted above the fireplace in the next room flickered to life on its own, some automated schedule kicking in, tuned to a news channel that neither of them had asked for. Julian's head snapped toward the sound first, his whole body going rigid in a way that told Harper, before she even turned to look, that whatever was on that screen was about to end whatever peace they'd just found. Eleanor's face filled the frame, mascara smudged with what looked like real tears, sitting across from a sympathetic anchor in a studio lit to make her look as fragile as possible. Terrifying, honestly, Eleanor was saying, her voice trembling on cue. I always sensed something was wrong with her, the way she looked at Julian. I never imagined she'd actually try to hurt him. The Chiron scrolling beneath her read, breaking. Hotel maid identified as suspect in attempted poisoning of crime family here. Harper's fork clattered against the plate, on screen. A photo of her own face, pulled from some old social media account, filled half the broadcast. Beneath a headline calling her a person of interest in an active criminal investigation. They're saying I did it, she whispered. They're saying I'm the one who tried to poison you. Julian was already moving, already reaching for his phone, his expression sliding into something cold and focused that made the calm kitchen table version of him from a few minutes ago feel like it belonged to a different night entirely. Citywide manhunt. The anchor continued behind them, with police urging anyone who sees this woman to contact authorities immediately and avoid approaching her directly, as she may be considered armed and dangerous. Somewhere down the hall, a siren wailed past on the street below, faint through the thick glass but unmistakable. And Harper felt the fragile safety of the last few hours crack straight down the middle. The elevator doors opened before Harper had time to process what she'd just watched on the news, and 6 men stepped into the penthouse's main hallway, all of them in the same dark suits as the guards from the alley, all of them with the same flat, professional expressions, all of them with their hands already moving toward their weapons. Julian, one of them, stepped forward, older than the rest, gray threading through his temples. A man who carried himself like someone used to giving orders rather than following them. We need her secured now, before this gets any further out of hand. Marcus Julian's voice stayed level. But Harper could hear the warning underneath it, a tone she hadn't heard from him yet. Stand down. You didn't see what I just saw. Marcus's hand drifted to the gun at his hip. And behind him. The other men mirrored the movement, 5 weapons rising in a slow, coordinated arc that ended pointed somewhere in Harper's direction. The footage is everywhere. Sterling's people are saying she's connected to the Moretti family, that this whole thing, the gala, the poisoning, all of it, was a setup to get her inside our operation. That's not true, Harper said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. I've never even heard the name Moretti before tonight. That's exactly what someone planted by them would say. Marcus didn't look at her when he spoke, kept his focus locked on Julian instead. Like Harper's a problem to be solved rather than a person in the room. I've spent 15 years keeping this family safe. I'm not about to let some maid with a convenient sob story walk in here and burn it all down because you liked the way she looked in your jacket. Julian moved so fast Harper barely registered it happening. 1 second he was standing beside her. The next he had crossed the distance to Marcus. Gripped his wrist and twisted the gun free of his hand in a motion so practiced it looked almost gentle. Despite the sharp intake of breath it pulled from Marcus's throat. You don't draw a weapon in my home, Julian said quietly, on someone under my protection. Not for any reason, not even you. The other men had gone still. Weapons lowered now, watching their second-in-command get disarmed by the man they all answered to. Marcus rubbed his wrist, jaw tight, but he didn't argue further. The evidence is convincing, Julian, doctored or not. If it gets in front of the wrong people, it doesn't matter what's true. It only matters what they believe. Then we find out who's really behind the footage, Julian said, before anyone else decides to believe it. He turned to Harper, something apologetic in his eyes that he didn't have time to fully express. I need to handle this. Stay with Chloe. Don't leave this floor. She nodded, though her legs felt unsteady beneath her, and watched him disappear into the elevator with 2 of his men, the doors sliding shut on a version of him she hadn't seen yet, the one underneath the careful, controlled surface he'd shown her all night. The hotel's private security office sat 3 floors below the main lobby, accessible only by a key card that very few people in the building actually possessed. Julian possessed one of them. Because he owned 40% of the property through a shell company, nobody at the hotel had ever bothered to trace back to him. The head of security, a heavyset man named Grant Holloway, looked up from his monitors when the door opened, his expression shifting from mild irritation to open fear in the space of about 2 seconds. Once he registered who was standing in the doorway. Mr. Vance. I wasn't expecting the footage from the gala, Julian said, closing the door behind him. The full footage. Every camera in that ballroom. I want it now. I already turned over what we had to the police. Standard protocol, given the circumstances. I'm not asking about what you gave the police. Julian crossed the room and set a black duffel bag on the desk beside Holloway's keyboard, unzipping it just enough to reveal the edge of stacked bills inside. Then, with the same unhurried motion, he pulled a Glock from beneath his jacket and set it on the desk beside the bag. The raw footage. All of it. Uncut, unedited, time-stamped, or a bullet, choose. Holloway stared at the 2 objects on his desk, like they might rearrange themselves into a less terrifying combination if he looked long enough. Sweat had already broken out along his hairline. There's footage that didn't make it to the police, he admitted finally, his voice cracking. Someone came to me 2 days before the gala. Paid me to make sure certain angles never got pulled if anything happened that night. I didn't know what they were planning, I swear. I just thought it was some kind of surveillance thing. Insurance fraud, maybe. I didn't ask questions because they paid enough that I didn't want to. Who paid you? I don't know his name. Big guy, expensive suit. Said he worked for Victor Sterling's people. Holloway's hands were shaking now as he pulled up a folder on his monitor, one buried 3 layers deep in an unmarked directory. This is everything. Every camera. Every angle. All of it, going back 2 weeks. Julian leaned over his shoulder, scanning the file names scrolling past, until one near the bottom caught his eye. It wasn't labeled with a date or a camera number like the others. It was labeled, in plain text, with 3 words. The maid's mother. Open that one, Julian said. Holloway clicked it, and a document unfolded on the screen. Dense with financial figures and account numbers Julian recognized instantly. The same kind of buried transaction trail Robert Dane had spent years trying to expose before Victor Sterling had him killed. Except this version went further. It included a name Julian hadn't expected to see attached to the file at all: Marissa Collins. Harper's mother. There was a payment record dated 8 years ago, routed through 3 shell accounts before landing. Finally, in a numbered account that Julian's own financial team had flagged 18 months into his investigation without ever managing to attach a name to it. Beside the transaction was a single handwritten note, scanned in from what looked like an old physical ledger. Silence the source before she talks to Dane's people. Handle quietly. The date lined up almost exactly with the week Harper's mother had died. Julian felt something settle in his chest, cold and absolute. The confirmation of a suspicion he'd carried for months finally solidifying into proof. He pulled a small drive from his pocket and copied the file, along with the raw ballroom footage. Working in silence while Holloway sat frozen beside him, too afraid to speak. "You're going to disappear for a while," Julian said finally, straightening up. "Take the money. Don't go home first. Don't call anyone. If Victor's people find out you talked to me, they'll assume you gave me everything, and they won't bother finding out if that's true before they act on it." Holloway didn't argue. He grabbed the duffel bag off the desk with both hands and was out the door within 30 seconds, leaving Julian alone with a drive full of the proof he'd spent 2 years chasing, and a name that connected all of it directly back to the woman currently sitting in his penthouse, 60 floors above him, waiting to find out what he'd learned. Harper's burner phone rang at exactly the wrong moment. She was sitting on the floor of Chloe's room, back against the bed frame, watching her sister's chest rise and fall in the dim amber light. When the unfamiliar ringtone shattered the quiet, she'd almost forgotten Julian's men had given her the phone, a cheap prepaid model with only one number programmed into it, in case of exactly this kind of emergency. She answered on the second ring. "Hello." "Harper," it was Dana, her neighbor from 2 doors down, the older woman who sometimes watched Chloe when Harper's shifts ran late. Her voice was shaking, pitched low like she was hiding somewhere. "Harper, oh thank God. I've been trying every number I could find." "Dana, what's wrong? What's happening?" "There are men here. At your building." A door slammed somewhere behind her, muffled through the phone's tiny speaker. "Suits, not police, I don't think. No uniforms. But they've got badges that they're flashing at everybody in the hallway. They're saying they're with Child Protective Services. They're saying they need to speak with you about Chloe. But Harper, something's wrong. They don't look like any caseworkers I've ever seen." Harper's blood went cold. "Are they at my apartment right now?" "They're at your door." A crash echoed through the phone, sharp and unmistakable, wood splintering under force. "Oh my God. They're kicking it in." "Harper, they're breaking down your door right now." Harper was on her feet before Dana finished the sentence. The phone pressed so hard against her ear it hurt. Chloe still sleeping peacefully behind her, utterly unaware that somewhere across the city, strangers with fake credentials had just torn down the door to the only home she'd ever known. Harper was already at the elevator by the time Julian stepped off it, the drive from the security office still in his pocket, his expression sliding from grim focus to alarm the second he saw her face. "They're at my building," before he could ask. "Dana called me. Men with fake CPS badges are breaking down my door right now. Chloe's not there, she's safe. She's 2 rooms away." Julian caught her by the shoulders, steadying her, though his own jaw had gone tight at the news. "This isn't about your sister anymore. It's about making sure there's nothing left in that apartment that contradicts whatever story they're building. Dana's still in the building. She's an old woman. Julian, she's terrified. And I'm the reason those men are there at all." Harper pulled free of his grip, already moving toward the elevator doors. "I have to go back. That's exactly what they want. An APB is out on you right now with your face plastered across every local news channel. The second you set foot within 3 blocks of that building, real police will be called. And this time it won't be Sterling's men pretending to be authorities. It'll be the actual authorities. And they'll have every reason in the world to take you in." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Sit up here and let an old woman get hurt because of me. Julian studied her for a long moment, something conflicted moving behind his eyes. And Harper understood, watching him, that he was weighing two versions of protecting her against each other and hadn't yet decided which one mattered more. I'm coming with you, he finally said, but we do this my way. You stay in the car until I clear the building. No arguments. She nodded, already halfway convinced she'd break that promise the second she saw the building's front doors, and followed him back into the elevator. The drive across the city took 11 minutes, most of it in silence. Rain still streaking the windows in thin gray lines that blurred the passing streetlights into long smears of light. Harper sat with her hands pressed flat against her knees, trying to keep them from shaking, trying not to think about her mother's death certificate sitting in a folder somewhere in Julian's penthouse, about a note that read Silence the Source, about how easily her own name could end up attached to a similar file someday if tonight went badly enough. When they turned onto her street, the flashing lights hit her first, blue and red strobing off wet pavement, 3 squad cars parked at angles across the road. A small crowd of neighbors gathered on the sidewalk despite the hour, phones out, recording, stay here, Julian said, already reaching for the door handle. Harper didn't stay. She was out of the car before he'd fully registered she'd moved, weaving through the gathered crowd toward the building's entrance, scanning faces for Dana's, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. She caught sight of her neighbor near the mailboxes, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, being questioned by a uniformed officer, and relief flooded through her chest so fast it nearly buckled her knees. Then a hand closed around her arm from behind. That's her, a voice said. That's the Collins woman, the one from the news. Harper turned, and the officer's expression had already shifted from routine to alert, his hand dropping to the radio at his shoulder. Around her, other officers began converging, drawn by the sound of her name, and within seconds she was surrounded. 4 uniforms closing in around her on a sidewalk full of neighbors who'd known her for years, all of them now watching with the same wary suspicion the internet had spent the last several hours teaching them to feel. Harper Collins, you're being detained pending questioning in connection with an assault investigation. I didn't assault anyone. Her voice came out higher than she wanted it to, panic cracking through the careful calm she'd been holding on to all night. I'm the one who got poisoned wine dumped on me. I didn't do anything, ma'am. I need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back. She saw Julian pushing through the crowd on the far side of the street, saw him shouting something at the nearest officer, his voice sharp with an authority that had worked on every other person he'd used it on tonight. It didn't work here. A cop with a citywide manhunt bulletin in his hand and a viral video already burned into his memory wasn't going to be talked down by a man in an expensive suit, no matter how much weight that suit usually carried. Sir, step back or you'll be detained as well. Harper felt her arms wrenched behind her, cold metal closing around her wrists, and something in her chest gave way entirely. The last thread of composure she'd been holding on to since the ballroom finally snapping. She didn't fight it. Fighting it would only make things worse. She knew that, had always known that. The way anyone who grew up the way she did learns early that resistance costs more than it buys. But her whole body shook as they walked her toward the nearest squad car, past neighbors who wouldn't meet her eyes, past a street she'd lived on for 3 years that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Harper, Julian's voice cut through the noise, raw in a way she hadn't heard from him yet. I'll get you out. Do you hear me? I'll get you out tonight. She didn't answer. Couldn't. The officer's hand on top of her head guided her down into the back seat, and the door shut with a heavy, final click that sealed off the sound of the street entirely. The precinct smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead in a way that made Harper's skull ache. They took her prints, her photo, walked her through a booking process that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Someone who had actually done the things the internet was saying she'd done. The holding cell was worse. 6 women shared the space with her, most of them silent, a few of them watching her with open curiosity once word filtered through that she was the one from the news. Harper sat on the metal bench, knees drawn up to her chest despite the uniform skirt she was still wearing. still stained faintly with wine she hadn't had time to change out of, and tried to make herself as small as possible. It didn't work. Nothing about her body had ever made itself small, and tonight, of all nights, that fact seemed to draw more attention rather than less. "You're the maid," one of the guards said, pausing outside the cell with a clipboard. Looking her over with an expression Harper had spent her whole life learning to recognize before it fully formed. "The one who tried to poison that mob guy. Can't imagine what he saw in you." Laughter rippled from somewhere down the hall, another guard joining in, their voices carrying easily in the concrete space. "Probably figured nobody'd suspect the fat girl in the cheap uniform," the second guard added. "Hide in plain sight. Right, smart. If you think about it." Harper stared at the floor, at a scuff mark on the concrete that had probably been there for years, and let the words wash past her without responding. She had learned, a long time ago, that giving people the reaction they wanted only fed whatever ugliness had made them say it in the first place. Silence didn't fix anything, but it starved the moment of the satisfaction they were fishing for. Still, something in her chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with the cold bench beneath her. She thought about Chloe, asleep 60 floors up in a bed that cost more than their apartment's entire security deposit. Blissfully unaware that her sister was sitting in a holding cell, being mocked by strangers for the crime of existing in a body the world had decided wasn't worth protecting. She thought about her mother. Dead 8 years now. Silenced by the same kind of man who was apparently willing to burn Harper's whole life down just to keep his secrets buried a little longer. She thought about Eleanor's face in that ballroom, smiling as she delivered 2 words that had somehow followed Harper through every essor since. "Know your place." For the first time all night. Sitting in a cell that smelled like bleach and old fear, Harper let herself feel something other than terror. She let herself feel angry. It took Julian 4 hours to get her out. Harper didn't know the details until later, wouldn't learn until the next morning exactly what it had cost him. But she understood enough in the moment from the way the desk sergeant's demeanor shifted, the instant Julian walked through the precinct doors at nearly 6 in the morning. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply set a manila envelope on the counter, said a name Harper didn't catch, and watched the sergeant's face drain of color before disappearing into a back office to make a phone call. 20 minutes later, Harper walked out of the holding cell a free woman, no charges filed. Her name quietly scrubbed from whatever system had flagged it hours earlier. Julian was waiting in the lobby, and the second she came through the door, something in his controlled expression cracked entirely. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms without asking, and Harper let him. Too exhausted and too raw to do anything but stand there and absorb the warmth of it. "I told you to stay in the car," he murmured into her hair. "I couldn't just sit there while Dana was scared out of her mind." "I know." He pulled back enough to look at her, his hand still braced on her shoulders, checking her over with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time in years, like someone was actually paying attention to whether she was okay. "Are you hurt? Did anyone in there?" "I'm fine. Just tired." It wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough, and she didn't have the energy left to explain the particular exhaustion of being mocked in a cell by people whose job was supposed to be protecting her. "What did you have to do to get me out?" Julian's expression shuddered slightly. "Don't worry about that part, Julian." He exhaled, glancing around the mostly empty lobby before answering, his voice dropping low. "The police commissioner has a few things in his past he'd prefer stayed buried." I reminded him of that. He made a call. "The charges disappeared. You blackmailed the police commissioner." "For me, I'd have done a lot worse than that." He said it simply, without theatrics, like it was just a fact of the world rather than a confession. "I told you in that alley I'd protect you. I meant it. I don't make promises I don't intend to keep." Harper studied his face in the harsh fluorescent light of the precinct lobby, taking in the exhaustion carved into it, the same exhaustion she felt in her own bones. And something shifted in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or gratitude. Something more complicated and harder to name. "Take me to my sister," she said quietly. Julian nodded, one hand settling at the small of her back as he guided her toward the exit, past officers who avoided eye contact now, past the same desk sergeant who'd been so quick to book her hours earlier, and now couldn't look up from his paperwork fast enough. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten at the edges. Dawn creeping over a city that had spent the entire night trying to destroy her. And Harper walked into it leaning slightly against a man who, 12 hours ago, had been a complete stranger, and who now felt like the only solid thing left standing in her life. I meant what I said back there, Julian added, once they were in the car, the precinct shrinking behind them in the rearview mirror. I will burn this city down before I let them do that to you again. Harper didn't doubt him. What frightened her more than anything else that had happened that night was realizing she didn't want him to stop. Dana wouldn't stop apologizing. Harper sat across from her in a small, sunlit room on the 40th floor of Julian's building, a floor she hadn't known existed until that morning. One apparently reserved for exactly this kind of situation. Dana had been brought there sometime after Harper's arrest. Whisked aside from the chaos of the apartment building by two of Julian's men before the fake CPS agents could finish whatever they'd come to do. And she'd spent the better part of an hour since then, clutching a mug of tea with both hands, repeating the same handful of sentences. I should have called the real police the second I saw them, Dana said again. I should have known something was wrong. You did everything right. Harper reached across the small table and covered the older woman's trembling hands with her own. You called me. That's what mattered. They tore your apartment apart, sweetheart. I saw it before they pulled me out. Every drawer, every cushion. Like they were looking for something. Harper's stomach tightened. She hadn't had time to process that detail yet, too consumed with worry over Dana and the arrest that followed. But now it settled into place, alongside everything else Julian had shown her. They hadn't been looking for Chloe at all. They'd been looking for something else. Something her mother might have left behind. Julian appeared in the doorway before she could chase the thought any further. Dressed now in a plain black jacket rather than the tailored suits she'd seen him in all night. His expression sharpened with the particular focus she was starting to recognize as his war face. We found something, he said. The tracking data on the men who hit your building. Their vehicle's GPS pinged consistently at an old warehouse near the docks before and after the raid. Same location my financial team flagged months ago as a Sterling holding, though we never confirmed what it was actually used for. You think they're keeping records there. I think it's worth finding out. He held her gaze. But I need you to understand what I'm asking. Breaching that building means going somewhere Victor Sterling controls completely. It's dangerous in a way tonight hasn't been yet. Harper thought of the note Dana had described. The men tearing through her apartment for something specific. Something connected to a mother who'd been dead 8 years and still wasn't allowed to rest. She thought of the ledger entry Julian had shown her hours ago, the cold, clinical instruction to silence the source, and felt the anger from the holding cell rise back up through her exhaustion, steady and clarifying. I'm coming with you, she said. Harper, you said it yourself. She left something behind. Something worth breaking down my door at 4 in the morning for. If there's any chance it tells me the truth about what happened to her, I need to be there when you find it. Julian studied her for a long moment, and whatever he saw in her face must have convinced him arguing wouldn't work. Because he simply nodded once and reached for the tactical vest one of his men had left folded on a nearby chair. Then you do exactly what I say. When I say it, he said, holding it out to her. No exceptions this time. The warehouse sat at the far edge of the docks, a rusted hulk of corrugated metal surrounded by a chain-link fence and exactly 2 visible guards, both of whom Julian's men handled with a quiet, efficient precision that left Harper more unsettled than reassured. She'd never seen violence up close before tonight. Not really. And the ease with which Julian's crew moved through it, disarming, restraining, working in near silence, told her more about the world she'd stumbled into than any of the explanations he'd given her so far. Inside the warehouse was a maze of shipping containers and dim overhead lights, the air thick with the smell of rust and stagnant water. Julian moved through it like he'd memorized the layout from a blueprint, which, Harper realized, he probably had. They found the office in the back corner, a reinforced steel door that took 2 of Julian's men nearly 10 minutes to breach, cutting through a lock system that looked more suited to a bank vault than a shipping warehouse. Inside, the room was surprisingly ordinary. A metal desk, A filing cabinet. A single computer, dark and unplugged, and built into the far wall. Disguised behind a false panel that Julian found within a seconds of running his hand along the seam. A safe roughly the size of a small refrigerator. "You've done this before," Harper observed, watching him work the dial with practiced fingers. "More times than I'd like to admit." The safe clicked open, and Julian pulled the heavy door wide, revealing rows of physical ledgers. The old-fashioned kind, leather-bound and handwritten, along with a stack of file folders thick enough that Harper's arms ached just looking at them. They worked in silence for the better part of an hour, spreading the ledgers across the desk, cross-referencing dates and account numbers under the harsh beam of a flashlight. Harper wasn't trained for this kind of work, had never once in her life looked at a financial document more complicated than a utility bill. But Julian walked her through the patterns patiently, showing her how to spot the discrepancies, the shell accounts, the payments that didn't match any legitimate transaction on the books beside them. "Here," Julian said finally, his voice tight, sliding a ledger across the desk toward her. "This is it." Harper leaned over the page. A payment, dated 8 years ago, routed through the same numbered account she'd seen referenced in the digital file back at the security office. Beside it, in the same handwriting from the note Holloway had shown him, a fuller explanation than the fragment they'd found before M. Collins discovered discrepancy in Q3 shipment invoices, threatened to bring findings to R. Dane handled 614. Coroner paid in full, case closed as cardiac event. Harper's hands went cold around the edge of the desk. There it was, in black ink on yellowed paper, the truth she'd been denied for 8 years. Reduced to a single administrative line in a dead man's ledger. Her mother hadn't died of a weak heart. She'd died because she'd found something she wasn't supposed to find, and told someone she trusted, and paid for that honesty with her life. They killed her for doing the right thing, Harper said quietly, for telling the truth about what she saw. Julian's hand found her shoulder, steady and warm. "And this proves it. Not just to us. To a court. To the entire city. Once this gets in front of the right people." He gathered the ledgers carefully, along with a handful of file folders bearing Robert Dane's name across their tabs, sliding everything into a reinforced case one of his men had brought along for exactly this purpose. "We have everything we need to end this, Harper, tonight." Something in the certainty of his voice cracked through the grief, still settling in Harper's chest, replacing it, slowly, with something that felt dangerously close to hope. She had spent 8 years believing her mother's death was a cruel accident of biology, a heart that simply gave out too soon. Tonight, for the first time, she understood it as something else entirely, not an accident. A murder that someone had worked hard to bury, and that she now had the power to unearth. She looked up at Julian, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him even in the cold, damp air of the warehouse office. And something passed between them that neither of them tried to name. "Thank you," she said, "for not letting this stay buried. I made a promise to Robert a long time ago that I'd finish what he started." Julian's hand rose, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything else about the night. "I didn't know, when I made it, that finishing it would also mean finally giving your mother's death the truth it deserved. But I'm glad it did." Harper didn't decide to close the distance between them. It happened the way certain true things happen, without much deliberation, her hand finding the front of his jacket, his forehead dropping to rest against hers for one suspended second before either of them moved further. When he kissed her, it wasn't performative or rushed, nothing like the tabloid version of Tonight that was still circulating online, painting her as some calculating mistress chasing a wealthy man's attention. It was quiet, deliberate. The kind of thing two exhausted people share after surviving something together that neither of them expected to survive. She pulled back first, breathless, resting her forehead against his shoulder while her heartbeat settled into something calmer than it had been in hours. "We should get this evidence somewhere safe," she murmured. "We should." Julian didn't move to let her go right away. "In a minute." The minute they'd allowed themselves didn't last much longer than that. Julian's phone buzzed in his pocket, sharp and insistent. and the tension that had briefly eased from his shoulders snapped straight back into place the second he glanced at the screen. He answered it, and Harper watched his expression shift from cautious to something far darker as a voice she didn't recognize. Tinny and distant through the speaker, filled the silence of the office. "Put it on speaker," Harper said, already sensing whatever was coming wasn't good news. Julian hesitated only a second before complying, and Victor Sterling's voice, calm and unhurried in a way that made Harper's skin crawl, filled the small room. "Julian, I trust you found what you were looking for in my warehouse." Julian's voice had gone flat, controlled in a way that Harper recognized now as the version of him he used when he was managing rage rather than expressing it. "You should have known better than to send men to raid an apartment while you're actively under investigation. A minor miscalculation, I'm addressing it now. Actually, from a much better vantage point." A pause, deliberate and unsettling. Stretched over the line, "Look out the window, Julian, whichever window you're closest to. I promise you'll want to see this." Julian crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling back a section of corrugated metal that served as a makeshift window near the office's back wall. And Harper followed, her pulse climbing with a dread she couldn't yet explain. Across the water, on the roof of a warehouse nearly identical to the one they stood in, a thin red laser dot flickered against the night, tracing a slow, deliberate path before settling and holding steady. On a spot Harper's eyes followed with rising horror straight back toward Julian's own building, rising 60 stories into the skyline behind them. "I have a very good vantage point on your penthouse tonight," Victor continued, his voice never rising, never wavering, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. "Your security is excellent, Julian, truly. I'll give you that. But even the best security has blind spots when the man watching already knows every inch of the building's original blueprints. I had a hand in financing its construction, after all, a long time ago." Harper's breath caught. "Chloe, ah," Victor said, and she could hear the smile in his voice even without seeing it. "The little sister. Asthmatic, isn't she? Fragile lungs. Terrible thing. To have your survival depend so entirely on things beyond your control." Another pause. Longer this time, deliberate and cruel. "I have a very talented associate positioned with a clear line of sight into her room right now. One word from me. And this whole tragic story ends with a little girl who never even got the chance to grow up and understand why the world was so unkind to her sister. If you touch her," Julian started, his voice dropping into something Harper had never heard from him before, low and lethal. "I won't need to, if you bring me the ledger. All of it, every page, every file. Whatever you manage to dig out of my warehouse tonight, bring it to the docks yourself, Julian. Alone, no men, no tricks. No clever plans with the FBI or whatever other allies you think you have waiting in the wings. You have 1 hour, and if I bring backup, or call the authorities, or do anything other than exactly what you've asked, then look out the window one more time," Victor said, "and watch what happens to her before you finish your next sentence." The line went dead. Harper stood frozen at the window, staring across the water at a red laser dot she could no longer see but knew, with absolute certainty, was still trained somewhere on the building behind them. Somewhere close to the room where her sister was sleeping, utterly unaware that her life had just become a bargaining chip in a war she'd never asked to be part of. "We have to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now, we have to get to her." Julian was already moving, sweeping the evidence case off the desk, his expression carved into something grim and focused that told Harper, more clearly than any words could have, that whatever came next was going to cost both of them more than either had been prepared to give. "We will," he said. "But we do this smart, or we lose everything we just found, and Chloe along with it. I need you to trust me one more time tonight." Harper looked at him, at the man who had spent the last several hours proving, again and again, that his promises meant something, and nodded, even as every instinct in her body screamed at her to run straight for the car and not stop until she'd pulled her sister into her arms. "Okay," she said. "Get us home." The penthouse was a fortress by the time they returned, more guards stationed at every entrance than Harper had seen all night. Sniper countermeasures, Julian's team had scrambled to deploy the moment his call to building security went out. Still, none of it fully settled the terror sitting in Harper's chest. Not until she'd crossed the threshold of Chloe's room and confirmed with her own eyes that her sister was still breathing, still safe, curled up against a stuffed animal one of the staff had found for her sometime during the night. The panic room's the safest place in the building, Julian said, guiding both of them down a short hallway off the master suite, toward a door that looked, from the outside, like nothing more than an ordinary closet. Reinforced glass, independent air supply. No direct line of sight from any angle outside the building. Even Victor's people can't touch you in here. The room itself was small but comfortable. A narrow bed built into one wall, a bank of monitors along another. Glass thick enough that Harper could see the faint shimmer of its layered construction when the light hit it just right. Julian's settled Chloe onto the bed without waking her fully, tucking a blanket around her small frame, and Harper felt something in her chest ease slightly at the sight, even surrounded by all this fear. "I need to go deal with what Victor asked," Julian said, straightening. "The ledger, I have a plan. But I need you both to stay in here until I come back for you myself. No exceptions." "You're not seriously considering giving him what we found." "I'm considering exactly what it takes to keep your sister alive in the next hour." His expression was unreadable in a way that unsettled her more than his usual controlled calm. "Trust me a little longer. Harper, please." She wanted to argue, wanted to demand a fuller explanation. But the exhaustion of the night had finally caught up with her fully, dragging at her limbs, blurring the edges of her focus. She nodded instead, watching him disappear back through the panic room's heavy door, the automatic lock sealing shut behind him with a soft, final hiss. For a while, she simply sat beside her sister, listening to the steady rhythm of Chloe's breathing, trying to let it calm the frantic pace of her own heartbeat. She thought about the kiss in the warehouse, about the ledger entry that had finally given her mother's death a name and a reason, about Victor Sterling's voice on the phone describing her sister's asthma like an inconvenient detail rather than a life hanging in the balance. She was nearly asleep, her back against the reinforced wall, when voices drifted through the thin gap beneath the panic room's door. Julian's voice, and Marcus's, the lieutenant who'd drawn a weapon on her hours earlier. Harper sat up slowly, careful not to wake Chloe, and pressed her ear against the cool glass of the door, straining to catch the conversation happening in the hallway beyond. "Hand over the ledger to Victor," Julian was saying, his voice low but perfectly audible in the quiet of the sealed hallway. "All of it. Give him the maid's file, too." Harper's stomach dropped. "You're sure about this?" Marcus asked. "After everything tonight, you're just going to fold." "I'm not risking my entire empire for an asthmatic kid," Julian said, flat and final. "Get the case. We're doing this his way." The words landed like a physical blow, each one settling into Harper's chest with a weight that made it hard to breathe. She backed away from the door, her hand pressed against her mouth to keep any sound from escaping, staring at her sleeping sister as the full meaning of what she'd just heard crashed over her. He was going to hand them over. Everything they'd found. Everything that proved her mother's death was murder rather than accident. All of it. Traded away like currency to protect an empire she'd never asked to be part of in the first place. And Chloe's file. Whatever information Victor's people had compiled on a 10-year-old girl's medical vulnerabilities. Handed over right along with it. A target painted directly onto her sister's back in exchange for Julian's continued safety. She had let herself believe, over the last several hours, that this man was different, that his protection meant something real, something that would hold even when the cost got high enough to matter. She had kissed him in a warehouse full of evidence of her mother's murder and let herself hope, for the first time in years, that someone else might actually carry some of her weight. She had been wrong. Just another disposable person in a world that had never once, in her entire life, proven her worth mattering more than someone else's convenience. Harper's grief curdled fast into something harder, something with edges. She looked around the small room, at the monitors, at the reinforced glass, at the narrow bed where her sister still slept peacefully, unaware that the two adults meant to protect her had already decided her safety was negotiable. Not this time. Harper thought. Not my sister. Not while I still have breath in my body. Her eyes landed on a small fire extinguisher mounted beside the door. Standard equipment. Probably never meant to be used the way she was about to use it. Beside it, a red emergency release panel, clearly labeled, clearly not meant for casual use. She didn't hesitate. Harper wrenched the extinguisher from its mount, its weight straining her arms, and swung it hard against the panel's plastic housing. It took 3 strikes before the casing cracked, sparks flaring briefly from the exposed wiring beneath. And on the 4th strike, the mechanism gave way entirely, the panic room's heavy lock disengaging with a mechanical groan. Chloe, she crossed the room and shook her sister gently awake, keeping her voice as calm as she could manage despite the roar of blood in her ears. Sweetheart, I need you to wake up. We're going for a little walk. Chloe blinked up at her, groggy and confused. Is everything okay? Everything's going to be okay, Harper said, pulling her sister up and into her arms. Her 10-year-old body still small and light despite how much she'd grown in the last year. I promise. Just hold on to me. She carried Chloe out through the panic room's broken door, into a hallway that had gone quiet. Julian's voice no longer audible from wherever the conversation had continued. Harper moved fast, driven by an adrenaline that had burned away every trace of her earlier exhaustion. Cutting through a service corridor she remembered from an earlier tour of the penthouse, past a kitchen staff member who called out in surprise as she pushed through toward a rear service elevator. She had no clear plan beyond getting Chloe somewhere Victor Sterling's reach couldn't follow. Somewhere far from a man who had just decided their lives were an acceptable price for his own safety. She pressed the call button for the service elevator with a shaking hand, glancing back over her shoulder every few seconds, half expecting Julian to appear and try to stop her, half hoping he would, so she could finally ask Kim to his face how he could have made that choice so easily. He didn't appear. The elevator arrived, and Harper stepped inside with Chloe still clutched against her chest, pressing the button for the ground floor with a force that betrayed how badly her hands were shaking. Where are we going? Chloe asked, fully awake now, sensing the tension radiating off her sister even without understanding its source. Somewhere safe, Harper said, though she had no real idea where that would be anymore. In a city where the man who'd promised to protect them had just proven, in the space of a single overheard sentence, that his promises had limits she hadn't been prepared for. The elevator doors opened onto a narrow service hallway near the building's rear entrance, rain visible through a small window at the far end, the sky beginning to lighten into the gray, exhausted color of early morning. Harper carried Chloe through it, out a heavy metal door that led out into a narrow alley behind the building. The same kind of alley where all of this had started less than 12 hours ago. She set Chloe down carefully once they'd cleared the doorway, crouching to her level, checking her breathing, relieved to find it still steady despite the abrupt waking and the chaos of the last several minutes. Stay right behind me, Harper said. We're going to find a cab, and then we're going somewhere far from here. She straightened, scanning the alley for any sign of a main road. And that was when she saw the figure standing at its far end, framed by the gray light of the coming dawn, a pistol held loose and confident at her side. Eleanor Sterling smiled, slow and satisfied, like a woman who'd been waiting for exactly this moment all night. Did you really think Cinderella survives in our kingdom? She said, raising the weapon with an ease that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd held one. Harper's arm shot out instinctively, shoving Chloe behind her, positioning her own body between her sister and the gun now leveled directly at her chest. She had no plan, no weapon, nothing but the same stubborn refusal that had gotten her through every hard thing in her life so far, the simple, unshakable determination that whatever happened next, it would happen to her before it happened to Chloe. You don't have to do this, Harper said, her voice steadier than she expected. Whatever your father's told you, whatever lies he's fed you about who deserves what in this world, you don't have to be the one who pulls that trigger. Know your place, Eleanor said again, the same 2 words from the ballroom, delivered now with none of the performative sweetness she'd used in front of the cameras. Stripped down to something raw and ugly underneath, the gunshot cracked through the alley, sharp and final, echoing off the brick walls on either side. The bullet missed by inches. Harper felt the heat of it pass close enough to her shoulder that her whole arm went numb for a second. Some strange trick of the body registering danger before the mind could catch up. She grabbed Chloe by the collar of her pajama shirt and dragged her sideways, both of them crashing behind a rusted dumpster at the mouth of the alley just as a second shot cracked off the brick where Harper's head had been a moment earlier. "Stay down," Harper gasped, pressing Chloe flat against the wet pavement. Her own body curled protectively over her sister's smaller frame. "Stay down and don't move." Eleanor's heels clicked against the alley floor, unhurried, confident. The sound of a woman who believed she had all the time in the world to finish what she'd started. "You can't hide behind a dumpster forever," she called out, almost pleasant, like she was chatting over brunch rather than hunting a person down in an alley. "And your little sister can't hold her breath that long either. I can hear her wheezing from here." Harper's stomach twisted. Chloe's breath had gone thin and reedy beside her, panic tightening her airways the way it always did. The worst possible timing for an asthma attack Harper had ever witnessed in her life. She had no inhaler, no medication. Nothing but her own body between her sister and a woman with a gun and a grudge that had nothing to do with either of them. Then the world exploded. The blast came from above, a deep concussive roar that shook the ground beneath them, followed by a rain of glass and debris that sent Eleanor stumbling backward with a scream, her shot going wide as she threw an arm up to shield her face. Harper looked up in time to see flames licking out of a shattered window on one of the penthouse's upper floors, black smoke pouring into the graying dawn sky. Chunks of masonry raining down onto the street beyond the alley. "Julian," Harper breathed, horror closing around her throat. She didn't have time to process what the explosion meant, whether he was inside, whether he was safe, because the alley had erupted into new chaos entirely. A second team of men, different from Julian's guards, dressed in tactical gear rather than suits, poured in from the far end of the alley, moving with the coordinated efficiency of a unit that had rehearsed exactly this kind of operation. "There," one of them barked, spotting Harper and Chloe crouched behind the dumpster. "Get the kid." Harper surged upright before she'd fully thought it through, grabbing the only weapon within reach. A length of metal pipe leaning against the dumpster, some remnant of construction work long abandoned. She swung it hard at the first man who reached for Chloe, catching him across the forearm with enough force to make him grunt and stumble back. But there were 3 more behind him, and Harper's improvised weapon and raw fury weren't enough to hold off a trained team indefinitely. "Chloe, run!" Harper screamed, swinging the pipe again, buying whatever seconds she could. Chloe tried. Harper watched her sister scramble toward the mouth of the alley, small and fast and terrified. And for one heartbeat, Harper let herself believe it might actually work, that Chloe might slip past the chaos and disappear into the city beyond. A gloved hand closed around Chloe's arm instead, yanking her backward, and her scream cut through the alley louder than the explosion had. "No," Harper dropped the pipe and lunged, but 2 of the men caught her from behind, wrenching her arms back, her body no match for the combined strength pinning her in place. She watched, helpless, as they dragged Chloe toward a black van idling at the alley's far entrance, her sister's small feet scrabbling uselessly against the wet pavement, her wheezing breath audible even over the chaos. "Let her go." Harper's voice tore raw from her throat, fighting against the hands holding her. Every ounce of strength she had thrown uselessly against men who outweighed and outnumbered her. "She has asthma. She needs her inhaler. Please let her go." The van doors slammed shut on her sister's terrified face, and the vehicle peeled away from the alley before Harper could take another step toward it, tires screeching against wet asphalt, disappearing into the gray morning streets beyond. Harper's knees buckled, the men holding her let go, apparently satisfied that whatever fight had been in her had drained out entirely, and she collapsed onto the wet pavement, staring at the empty space where the van had been, her chest heaving with sobs that felt too big for her body to contain. Eleanor, still recovering from the explosion's shockwave, straightened herself and brushed debris off her ruined dress with an expression of pure disdain. "Was that really so hard?" she asked, stepping closer, gun still loose in her hand. "You could have just accepted your place from the beginning, saved everyone a lot of trouble." Harper looked up at her from the ground, tears mixing with rain on her face. And something in her chest hardened into a resolve she didn't fully recognize yet, forged in the space between grief and rage. "You're going to regret this," she said quietly. "All of it," Eleanor laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I really don't think." The rest of her sentence disappeared beneath the roar of an engine. A black SUV screeched around the corner of the alley, tires smoking against the pavement, and before it had fully stopped, the driver's door flew open and Julian emerged, moving faster than Harper had seen him move all night, a pistol already raised. His expression a mask of controlled fury that made even Eleanor take an involuntary step backward. He fired twice, quick and precise, and the two men still standing near Harper dropped before they'd fully registered the threat. Eleanor raised her own weapon in response, but Julian was already moving, crossing the alley in long strides, and by the time she pulled the trigger, he had thrown his own body between the gun and Harper's crouched form on the ground. The bullet caught him square in the chest. Harper watched it happen in a horrible, stretched out slow motion, the impact jerking Julian backward, his body absorbing the force meant for her, his knees buckling as he collapsed onto the wet pavement beside her. "Julian," she scrambled to him, her hands finding the front of his shirt, already soaked dark and spreading fast. "No, no, no. Stay with me. Please stay with me." Victor Sterling stepped out of the shadows at the alley's far end, unhurried, immaculate despite the chaos around him, a pistol held loosely at his side as he approached the scene with the calm satisfaction of a man watching a plan finally reach its conclusion. "Know your place, Maid," he said, stopping a few feet from where Harper knelt over Julian's bleeding body, and raised the gun until it pointed directly at Harper's forehead. Harper looked up at him, past the barrel of the gun, past the cold, satisfied expression on a face that had ordered her mother's murder 8 years ago, and was apparently prepared to finish the job on her tonight, and felt something in her that had nothing left to lose settle into place. "You killed my mother," she said, her voice shaking but clear, Julian's blood soaking warm and terrible through the fabric covering her knees. "You've spent tonight trying to kill the only man who ever tried to protect me, and you just took my sister. There's nothing you can do to me now that would actually scare me more than that." Bold words for a woman on her knees. Victor's finger tightened around the trigger. Harper closed her eyes, and in the half-second before whatever came next, she thought of Chloe's face disappearing into the back of that van, of her mother's smile in a photograph she'd never seen before tonight, of a folder full of proof that would now, she feared, die alongside her in this alley without ever reaching the people who needed to see it. The gunshot that followed didn't come from Victor's weapon. Harper's eyes flew open in time to see Victor stagger backward, a spray of blood blooming across his shoulder, his own gun clattering from his grip as he clutched at the wound with a sound somewhere between a grunt and a scream. Behind him, one of Julian's men, the same guard who'd questioned her loyalty hours earlier in the penthouse hallway, lowered his rifle from a rooftop position across the alley, his expression grim and satisfied in equal measure. "Marcus." Harper didn't have time to process the relief of it, because Julian's hand had found hers. Weak but insistent, his breathing ragged and shallow beneath the layer of what she now realized was body armor, torn and dented but apparently, miraculously, intact enough to have absorbed most of the bullet's force. "Vest," he managed, his voice barely audible over the chaos still unfolding around them. "Kevlar, knocked the wind out of me. Not as bad as it looks." Relief crashed through Harper so hard it nearly knocked her over, tears spilling freely now, half grief and half something close to disbelieving joy. "I thought I lost you." "Not yet." Julian pushed himself up onto one elbow, wincing hard, his other hand pressing against the bruised, cracked area of his chest where the vest had absorbed the impact. "Chloe. Where's Chloe?" Harper's brief relief collapsed back into terror. "They took her. A van black. I don't know where." "Julian, they took my sister." "We'll find her." He struggled fully upright, swaying for a moment before Harper caught his arm to steady him, his eyes already scanning the alley, tracking Victor where he'd collapsed against the brick wall, still conscious but bleeding heavily, disarmed and finally, for the first time all night, looking genuinely afraid. Victor's men don't move without his direct order, and he's not going anywhere. Across the alley, Eleanor had frozen in place, her gun forgotten at her feet where Julian's first shots had apparently forced her to drop it. Her earlier confidence replaced by something closer to panic as she watched her father bleed against the wall and three more of Julian's men close in around the alley's exits. "This isn't over," Victor gasped, pressing a hand hard against his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "You think one lucky shot changes anything? I have people all over this city. Your girlfriend's sister will be halfway across the state before you finish congratulating yourselves." Julian crouched down to Victor's level, his voice dropping into something cold and final that Harper hadn't heard from him, even in his angriest moments earlier that night. "You're going to tell me exactly where that van is headed," he said, "or I'm going to let Harper decide what happens to you next. And after everything you've taken from her tonight." I don't think you'll like her answer. Behind them, Sess rose in the distance, real ones this time, drawn by the explosion still burning somewhere above them in the penthouse tower. And Harper knelt in the wreckage of the alley, blood on her hands, her sister missing somewhere in the city, and understood that the night was far from finished with any of them yet. Victor gave up the docks faster than Harper expected, though not out of any sudden attack of conscience. Julian didn't have to threaten him further. He simply crouched beside the wounded man, pulled his phone from an inside pocket, and showed him a live tracking feed that made Victor's face go a shade paler than the blood loss alone could account for. "You didn't actually think I'd let a 10-year-old girl leave that alley without a way to find her again," Julian said. "I had a tracker sewn into the lining of her jacket the moment she arrived at my building. Standard precaution for anyone under my protection. I don't need you to tell me where she is. Victor, I need you to understand exactly how thoroughly your plan already failed before you can waste any more of my time." Harper stared at him, something between disbelief and gratitude, cutting through the fear still gripping her chest. "You've known where she was this whole time. I've known where the tracker was. Doesn't mean I know what condition she's in, or how many men are guarding her, or what Victor's people plan to do once they realize we're coming." Julian rose, wincing against the bruised ache still radiating through his ribs, and gestured for two of his men to secure Victor and Eleanor, both of them now cuffed and slumped against the alley wall under armed guard. "We move now before they have time to relocate her." Harper climbed into the SUV beside him, her hands still trembling from adrenaline and cold, and it was only once the vehicle was moving, sirens fading behind them as they cut through side streets toward the docks, that she found the words to ask the question that had been eating at her since the moment she'd overheard him in the hallway. "Why did you say it?" Julian glanced over at her. "In the hallway. Before I broke Chloe and me out of the panic room. I heard you tell Marcus you weren't going to risk your empire for an asthmatic kid. I heard you tell him to hand over everything, my mother's file included." Her voice cracked on the memory, the raw betrayal of it still fresh enough to sting even now. Knowing what she now suspected about the truth beneath it, "I need to know if you meant it." Julian's expression sobered, and for a moment he didn't answer, watching the passing streetlights slide across his face in alternating bands of light and shadow. "About 20 minutes before that conversation, one of my men found a listening device in the hallway outside the panic room," he finally said. "Small, professional grade. Planted sometime in the last few hours by someone with access to the building. We traced the signal. It was broadcasting directly to a receiver Victor's people had set up 2 blocks away. So you knew he was listening. I knew he was listening. And I knew if I didn't give him something believable, he'd assume I was stalling an escalate faster than we could prepare for. So I gave him exactly what he wanted to hear. A version of me willing to trade you and your sister away to protect my own interests." Julian's jaw tightened. "I hated saying it. I want you to understand that. Every word of it felt like poison coming out of my mouth. But I needed Victor to believe he'd already won. Long enough for Marcus to trace the transmission back to its source and get eyes on wherever his men were staged. You could have told me, given me some kind of signal, anything, instead of letting me believe if I'd told you. And Victor had any way of reading it on your face, on your body language, on anything. The whole plan would have collapsed." He reached over, his hand finding hers, steady despite the exhaustion and pain still etched into every line of his posture. "I'm not asking you to forgive how badly that hurt. I'm telling you the truth of what happened, because you deserve that much. even if the timing means you had to carry that grief alone for longer than either of us wanted. Harper turned the explanation over in her mind, feeling the sharp edges of her earlier anger soften slightly against the shape of it, though not disappear entirely. Trust, she was learning tonight, wasn't a single decision made once and then finished. It was something you kept choosing, over and over. Even when the reasons to doubt it kept piling up faster than the reasons to believe. Don't ever do that again, she said quietly. Even if it's strategic, even if it works. I won't, Julian said. And something in the simple certainty of his voice told her he meant it as fully as every other promise he'd made that night. The docks stretched out ahead of them in the gray light of early morning, a maze of shipping containers and rusted cranes. Fog rolling in off the water thick enough to blur the outlines of the buildings beyond a few hundred yards. Julian's phone showed the tracker's signal pulsing steady from somewhere near the center of the container yard and around them. More of his vehicles converged from different directions. A coordinated response assembling itself with a speed that told Harper this wasn't the first crisis this organization had faced together. But something else was happening too. Something Harper hadn't anticipated and didn't fully understand until Julian explained it. Watching a garbage truck roll into position at the yard's main entrance, blocking the exit with the casual authority of a vehicle that belonged exactly where it had stopped. Your neighborhood, Julian said, a note of something like wonder in his voice as he watched the scene unfold. Word travels fast when people care about someone. Harper stared, uncomprehending, until she saw the man climbing down from the truck's cab and recognized him as Frank, who'd worked the same route through her old apartment building for 6 years, who always saved her the good cardboard boxes when she was moving furniture, who'd once helped her carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs during a summer heatwave without being asked. Dana called half the building after they took you in, Julian said, checking a message that had just come through on his phone. Word got to people who know people, janitors, electricians, delivery drivers. Folks who move through this city every day and notice things nobody with real money ever bothers to look at twice. Across the container yard, a maintenance worker in an unmarked city uniform was already crouched over an electrical panel near the security office. And within seconds, the yard's floodlights flickered and died, plunging the entire dock into a heavy, disorienting darkness broken only by the pale gray light of dawn struggling through the fog. They're helping us, Harper said, something thick rising in her throat that had nothing to do with fear this time. They're helping you, Julian corrected gently. You spent years being kind to people the rest of this city walks past without seeing. Tonight, that kindness came back around when you needed it most. The darkness gave Julian's team the cover they needed. Harper watched from behind the SUV's open door as his men moved through the container maze in tight, coordinated pairs. Night vision equipment catching the confused scramble of Victor's remaining guards as their own lighting failed without warning. Somewhere nearby, a custodial worker had rigged a chemical smoke device near the yard's security cameras, blinding whatever surveillance Victor's people still had left. And Harper understood, watching it all unfold, that this wasn't just Julian's resources at work anymore. It was something else entirely. An entire invisible network of people the powerful never bothered to notice, turning their collective attention toward protecting one of their own. There, Julian said, pointing toward a shipping container near the yard's center, its door secured with a heavy padlock, exactly where the tracker's signal indicated. That's her. Harper was out of the SUV and running before he'd finished the sentence, ignoring his sharp call for her to wait. Closing the distance across the wet gravel with a speed born entirely of a fear that had been building since the moment she'd watched that van doors slam shut on her sister's terrified face. 2 guards moved to intercept her, but Julian's men were faster, dropping both of them before Harper had covered half the distance. And by the time she reached the container, one of the guards had already shot the padlock free with a suppressed weapon, the door swinging open into the pale, foggy light of dawn. Chloe sat curled in the far corner, knees pulled to her chest, tears streaking her face, but alive, breathing, terrified but unharmed. Harper crossed the container in 3 strides and pulled her sister into her arms, holding on so tight she worried for a second she might actually hurt her. But Chloe held on just as fiercely, her small body shaking with sobs against Harper's shoulder. "I'm here," Harper murmured into her hair, over and over. The words less for Chloe's benefit at that point than her own. A mantra to convince her own racing heart that this part, at least, was finally, truly over. "I'm here, you're safe. I've got you." Behind them, the sounds of the raid were already winding down. Julian's Zen securing the last of Victor's scattered guards. The fog beginning to thin as the sun climbed higher behind it. Harper carried Chloe out of the container into the gray morning light, and found Julian waiting a few feet away, his expression carrying a relief so raw it made him look, for the first time all night, genuinely young. "You found her," Harper said. "We found her," he corrected. And this time she didn't argue the distinction. Police flooded the docks within the hour. Real ones this time. Called in not by Victor's fabricated emergency but by an anonymous tip that had also, apparently, come with an attached digital package containing every piece of evidence Julian's team had gathered over the last several hours. The ledgers, the financial records, the audio recording Marcus had captured through the very listening device Victor's people had planted, unwittingly broadcasting their own confession straight back to the people investigating them. Federal agents arrived not long after, drawn by a case file that had apparently been building against Victor Sterling for over a year, one that Julian's evidence had just handed the final, missing pieces to complete. Harper watched from a safe distance, Chloe wrapped in a blanket against her side, as Victor was loaded into an ambulance under armed federal guard, his earlier composure entirely gone, replaced by the hollow expression of a man watching an empire collapse in real time. Eleanor came next, still in handcuffs, mascara streaked down her face, her designer shoes ruined by mud and dock water, screaming something about lawyers and lawsuits that nobody around her seemed particularly inclined to take seriously anymore. Harper stepped forward as they walked her past, close enough to catch Eleanor's furious, disbelieving eyes. "I know exactly where my place is," Harper said quietly, just loud enough for Eleanor alone to hear. "It's not on my knees, it never was." Eleanor's mouth opened, some retort forming, but the officer escorting her pulled her forward before she could deliver it, and the last Harper saw of her was her back, disappearing into the back of a patrol car, the fight finally, completely gone out of her. Julian appeared at Harper's side as the last of the federal vehicles pulled away, his shoulder bumping gently against hers, his hand finding Chloe's small one and giving it a gentle squeeze. "It's over," Harper said, though the words felt strange in her mouth. Unfamiliar after a night that had stretched out long enough to feel like it might never actually end. "This part is," Julian said. "There will be trials, depositions, a media circus that's probably already started. Given how much of tonight went viral before we even had the full story straight." He looked down at her, something gentler in his expression than she'd seen from him even in their quietest moments together. "But the part where anyone gets to hurt you and your sister for daring to exist in this city, that part's finished. I made sure of that tonight. And I'll keep making sure of it for as long as you'll let me." Harper looked out over the docks, at the fog finally burning off under the rising sun, at Chloe's exhausted but steady breathing beside her, at a night that had started with her on her knees in a ballroom and was ending with an entire invisible network of people who'd risked everything to make sure a stranger's family made it home safe. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to see what that looks like." Julian's hand found hers, and for the first time since the wine had spilled across her uniform 12 hours earlier, Harper let herself believe, fully and without reservation, that whatever came next might actually be good. 6 months is a long time when you spend most of it in courtrooms and depositions. It is a very short time when you spend the rest of it rebuilding a life you once thought had already been decided for you. Harper stood in the center of the Grand Sterling Hotel's lobby, though it hadn't carried that name in almost 4 months now, and let herself take in the space the way she used to take in other people's lives from the far side of a service cart. Marble floors. Still the same marble that had once bitten cold through her uniform, but polished now beneath her own 2 feet in shoes she'd chosen for herself, in a dress fitted by a designer who had spent an entire afternoon insisting that Harper's curves weren't something to minimize but something to celebrate outright. Cut and draped until the fabric moved like it had been made specifically for the body wearing it. Because it had been. The hotel had come to her through a settlement so large it had taken her accountant 3 separate meetings to fully explain it. Funds seized from Victor Sterling's collapsed empire and redirected, in part, toward restitution for the people his corruption had harmed most directly. Harper's name had been near the top of that list, alongside Robert Dane's surviving family, alongside a dozen other former employees, whose complaints about working conditions had been buried for years under sterling money and sterling silence. She could have taken the money and disappeared into a quieter life. Instead, she had bought the hotel outright, gutted its management structure from the top down, and spent the last 4 months rebuilding it into something that actually deserved the marble floors it stood on. Nervous, Julian's voice came from just behind her shoulder, and Harper turned to find him watching her with the same steady attention he'd brought to nearly every moment of the last 6 months. Fully healed now, the scar beneath his shirt the only remaining evidence of the bullet that had nearly ended everything in that alley. A little, Harper admitted. It's a lot of press for one afternoon. You've handled worse. She huffed a laugh, low and real. That's one way to put it. Around them, hotel staff moved through final preparations for the afternoon's press event, adjusting microphone stands, checking camera angles. The same kind of professional bustle that used to make Harper feel invisible when she was the one carrying the trays instead of standing at the center of the room. Now every staff member who passed her offered a genuine smile, a nod, the easy familiarity of people who worked for someone who had actually bothered to learn their names and their stories. The policy changes had come fast once the ownership transfer finalized. Equal pay across every position, regardless of role or department. A structure that had made half the city's hospitality industry watch with open skepticism. Certain it would collapse the hotel's profitability within a year. It hadn't. If anything, turnover had dropped to nearly nothing, and the actual reviews from actual guests, had started mentioning something Harper had never once seen praised in any hotel review before joining this industry from the bottom rung. They mentioned the staff, how they were treated, how that treatment showed up in every small interaction a guest might have during their stay. Mandatory respect training for management, with real consequences attached to violations rather than the quiet reassignments that used to sweep problems under the rug. A zero-tolerance policy for the kind of casual cruelty Harper had absorbed silently for 2 years before that night in the ballroom. The kind dressed up as jokes or offhand comments about weight, about class, about whose comfort mattered more in any given room. Dignity. Harper had told her new management team on her first day as owner, isn't a perk you extend to guests who tip well. It's the baseline. Everyone in this building gets it. Starting now. She glanced across the lobby to where Chloe sat on a plush bench near the entrance, 11 years old now, healthy and steady, an inhaler tucked into her bag out of habit rather than desperate necessity. Since the settlement had also covered a specialist who'd finally gotten her asthma under real control, instead of managed crisis to crisis. Dana sat beside her, laughing at something on Chloe's phone screen. Having moved into the building's staff housing months ago after Harper insisted on it, and unwilling to let the woman who'd risked everything for her family go back to living alone in an apartment 2 doors down from strangers. The front doors opened, and Julian's posture beside her shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The particular alertness he still carried whenever a door opened somewhere near Harper, even 6 months and one dismantled criminal empire later. But this wasn't a threat. It was press. Filing in slowly for the afternoon's scheduled announcement. Cameras and microphones and reporters who'd spent the last 6 months alternating between vilifying Harper as a gold digger and celebrating her as a symbol of exactly the kind of resilience this city liked to romanticize once the danger had passed. Harper had stopped caring much which version of the story they told. She'd lived the real one. That was enough. She took her place at the small podium set up near the lobby's center, Julian a respectful step behind her. Close enough to be present without overshadowing what belonged entirely to her. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steadier than it had ever been in that same lobby 6 months earlier, when steadiness wasn't something she'd been allowed to have. "I know a lot of you are here because this story got complicated and messy and viral before anyone actually knew the truth of it. I'm not here today to relitigate any of that. I'm here because I think there's something worth saying clearly. Now that the noise has finally settled, she looked out at the assembled cameras, at the staff gathered along the edges of the lobby. People she'd once served meals to and now employed. People who'd once watched her get humiliated on this very floor and now watched her stand at the center of it, entirely on her own terms. Society tells us our worth gets measured by things that shouldn't matter as much as they do. Harper continued. Dress size. Bank account. The uniform someone happens to be wearing when you walk past them. I spent most of my life believing that measurement, because everyone around me kept insisting it was true. And it's a hard thing to argue against when it's the only story anyone's ever told you about yourself. She paused, and in the quiet, she found Julian's eyes across the I know better now. The people who demand our silence when they strip away our dignity, those aren't the ones who deserve respect just because they hold power or money or a title. We clean their rooms sometimes. We serve their meals. But that doesn't mean their souls are cleaner than ours. Dignity isn't something you earn by fitting into a smaller category than the one the world tries to put you in. It's a birthright. Every single person walking through these doors, whether they're checking in for one night or scrubbing a bathtub on the fourth floor, gets to decide their own place in this world. Nobody else gets that vote. The lobby had gone fully silent, cameras still rolling. Staff along the edges, nodding along with an understanding that went deeper than any policy memo could have delivered on its own. Harper stepped back from the podium as the applause started, warm and genuine, and felt Julian's hand find the small of her back, steady and familiar. That was perfect. He murmured. I meant every word of it. I know. That's why it was perfect. Later, once the press had cleared out and the lobby had settled back into its ordinary afternoon rhythm, Julian found her near the grand staircase, away from the remaining staff, the last of the sunlight slanting gold through the tall windows. He didn't say anything at first. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, and Harper watched, her breath catching, as he lowered himself onto one knee in the middle of the same lobby where he'd once knelt beside her on cold marble to offer her nothing but the coat off his own back. This time he offered her a ring, small and elegant, catching the afternoon light in a way that made Harper's vision blur before she'd even fully registered what was happening. I told you once that I don't make promises I don't intend to keep, Julian said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet lobby, drawing the attention of the last few lingering staff and reporters who hadn't quite made it out the door yet. I'm making one more tonight, in front of everyone who matters. Not an empire I'm asking you to share as someone beneath me this time. An equal partnership, built the way you rebuilt this place. From the ground up. On the idea that everyone in it deserves to be treated like they matter. Harper laughed through her tears, both hands pressed to her mouth, staring down at a man who had spent 6 months proving, in 1,000 small and large ways, exactly what that kind of promise looked like when someone actually kept it. Yes, she said. Before he'd even finished asking the question, everyone in the lobby already understood was coming. Yes, absolutely. Yes. The applause that followed was louder than anything the press conference had produced, staff and guests and reporters alike. And Harper pulled Julian up into an embrace that felt, finally, entirely uncomplicated. No danger lurking at its edges. No threat waiting in the wings to snatch it away. Across the lobby, Chloe cheered loud enough to draw laughter from everyone within earshot. And Dana wiped at her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. And somewhere, beyond the tall windows, the city carried on with its ordinary evening. Entirely unaware that inside this particular building, a woman who'd once been told to know her place had just finished proving, beyond any argument, exactly what that place actually was. Not on her knees. Never again on her knees. Standing instead. At the very center of everything she'd built. Surrounded by people who'd chosen her. In a life she'd finally claimed entirely for herself. In the end, Harper's story is not only about a maid humiliated in front of the rich, or a mafia boss who placed his jacket over her shoulders when everyone else looked away. It is a story about dignity, truth, and the quiet strength of a woman who had been forced to survive long before anyone came to protect her. Harper began this journey on her knees, soaked in wine, mocked by people who thought money gave them the right to decide her worth. But what they never understood was that humiliation is not defeat. Being pushed down does not mean a person has lost. Sometimes the moment the world tries hardest to shame you is the same moment your real strength begins to rise. Harper's greatest power was not wealth, violence, or status. It was love. Her love for Chloe gave her the courage to stand against people far more powerful than herself. Her love for her mother gave her the strength to keep searching for the truth, even when that truth was painful. And her love for justice gave her the courage to stop accepting the lies that had controlled her life for 8 long years. She was not just a victim of a cruel family's game. She became the witness, the survivor, and the heart of the story. Julian's journey also carries a powerful lesson. A man can have money, guards, and an empire, but none of that makes him truly strong if he cannot protect the innocent. Real power is not shown by making people afraid. Real power is shown by standing between cruelty and the person it wants to destroy. When Julian chose to cover Harper with his jacket, he did more than defend a maid. He challenged an entire world that believed people like Harper could be used, blamed, and thrown away. The meaning of this story is clear. Never let anyone tell you to know your place when their only goal is to keep you beneath them. Your place is not on the floor. Your place is not inside someone else's lie. Your place is wherever your courage, your love, and your truth can carry you. Harper teaches us that even the most ordinary person can become extraordinary when protecting someone they love. And sometimes, the person society mocks the most is the one carrying the truth powerful enough to bring an empire down. So let this story remind every viewer: dignity cannot be stolen by humiliation. Truth cannot stay buried forever. And love, when it becomes courage, can stand against even the darkest kind of power. Harper was never weak. She was never just a maid. She was a sister, a daughter, a fighter, and a woman who finally understood that her worth had never belonged to the people who tried to destroy her. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.